Most people think time is like a river that flows swift and sure in one direction. But I have seen the face of time, and I can tell you, they are wrong.
I remember Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time as a timeless classic. For me, it was an incredible game with beautiful graphics, fluid gameplay, and an epic storyline led by characters I admired and rooted for. But I would be lying if I told you that those memories were in any way reliable. You see, time is a curious thing, and so too is memory. I was quite young during the PS2 days, and although I fondly remember playing Prince of Persia, running along walls and fighting sand monsters, I can't deny that those memories have aged. They've fractured and glazed over the years, and I suspect that nostalgia plays a crucial role in shaping how I actually remember Sands of Time. But surely I can't be entirely wrong in my thinking. After all, I'm not the only one who remembers Sands of Time like this, am I? That's a very good point, and one that I think is deserving of some examination. Sands of Time is a special kind of video game. When I say that, I'm not specifically talking about its story or its gameplay or even its graphics for that matter. But I am referring to its place in gaming's past and the impact that it made on the industry. The 6th generation was a crucial turning point for video games. Video games were no longer just something fun to play, but were quickly becoming something that was equally as fun to watch, telling stories with genuine character development and real emotional depth. It was a rising trend that really started its life in the 1980s with this very franchise. A franchise which, from its very beginning, was soaked in literary influence, and I hope to shed some light on how integral Sands of Time was during this period. Today, we unpack a game that has not only stood the test of time, but one where time is of the essence. This is a game that brought an underdog studio out of relative obscurity and made them a household name. A game that is about honour and glory and a young man who is determined to right the wrongs he has inflicted on the world and those he holds most dear. Today, we unpack Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. These are the Tales from the 1001 Nights. It is a modest collection of Middle Eastern folktales taken from a larger corpus that was compiled sometime between the 8th and 13th centuries, a period of cultural, economic and scientific prosperity in the Islamic world, often referred to as the Islamic Golden Age. The tales contained within are considered to be some of the best ever written. Not only are they masterpieces in the art of storytelling, but a lot of them were the first to utilise storytelling devices that have since become standardised in writing. Particularly, Nights is credited with the popularisation of the frame story. The frame story is a literary device used to incorporate a series of smaller narratives into one long, overarching narrative. In the case of the Night stories, the frame story centres on Scheherazade, who volunteers herself as a wife to King Shahryar. Each night she begins to tell the king a story, and then deliberately leaves it unfinished. The king, curious to hear how the story ends, postpones Scheherazad's execution, and the cycle continues, for a total of 1001 nights. Each tale that Scheherazade recounts depicts a world of wonder, suspense, and sometimes even horror, where powerful sorcerers scheme in dark corners, mighty jinn reside in enchanted lamps, and immense fortune and ruin are found across the 7 seas. For years they have inspired countless individuals and have influenced dozens of highly acclaimed works. But in 1985, they inspired one person in particular. This man, to be exact. Fresh out of Yale University and with one game already under his belt, Jordan Mechner was a young developer with real promise. Mechner found his footing in the video game industry through an ongoing shift in the market. The console side of things had crashed, drastically so, and as a result home computing was on the rise. These machines were becoming cheaper, more accessible to the everyday Joe, but they also allowed those very same Joes to develop their own games. His first game, Karateka, was developed while he was still at university using an Apple II. The game was a success, both for Mechner and its publisher Broderbund, so much so that Jeff Hulbert, in a review written for Hardcore Computers, called the game a breakthrough, stating that it was the most recent and best illustration of a trend towards computer games that looked like movies. Despite this praise, however, Mechner wasn't all that interested in continuing in the video game industry. When he left Yale, Mechner turned his attention to his other aspirations in life, specifically screenwriting, and worried that making another game would ensure his ties to the industry forever. Eventually, Mechner did return to game development, and in 1989, his second game was released. This time, it was a puzzle platformer called Prince of Persia. Set in medieval Persia, the Grand Vizier Jafar rules with an iron fist of tyranny. Jafar wants one thing and one thing alone, and that's the Sultan's throne. And the only thing standing between him and it is the Sultan's daughter, the princess. Locked away in a tower at the top of a temple, Jafar gives the princess a choice: marry him within the hour or die. Now, the fate of the princess, and all of Persia for that matter, rests in the hands of the princess's lover, the assumed Prince of Persia, who just so happens to be locked away in the dungeons far below. There isn't an awful lot happening here in terms of story. It's nothing a certain Italian plumber hasn't done before. But this was 1989, and back then storytelling in video games was often a simple means of justifying the gameplay. Nevertheless, the stakes are high, and the use of Persia for the game's setting, along with the locked away princess and evil vizier, fills the story with a sense of fairy tale wonder and magic that's ripped right from the pages of the Knight's Tales. Prince of Persia is a game that doesn't ask much of you, but its levels are convoluted and its gameplay is methodical, to the point where at times it feels a little clunky. It's easy to get turned around on yourself and lose track of where you're going. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Prince of Persia is more in common with the Metroidvania than it does with Mario Bros, so losing track of yourself is something to be expected. But it can become a worrying issue when you realise that the 1 hour time limit isn't just there for show, but is instead a very real and tangible thing. Yes, you have a genuine hour to beat this game, or else you lose. As a result, there is a horrifying sense of urgency when playing Prince of Persia. For the brief time I spent with it, I found myself second guessing almost every single choice I made. Prince of Persia requires patience, but it's hard to have patience when there's a ticking clock hanging over you at all times. The experience is tense and honestly thrilling because of it. And like Karateka before it, Prince of Persia isn't just a fun game to play, but also a fun game to watch as well. There's a weighty realism to the way the characters in Prince of Persia move. It's almost as if you're not looking at animated sprites but actual physical movement, and that's because, in a way, you are. When you look at the prince, you are technically looking at David Mechner, Jordan's younger brother. To create the animations for the game, Mechner utilised a form of animation known as rotoscoping. Rotoscoping requires an animator to trace over live action footage, frame by frame, in order to produce realistic animation. Mechner recorded his brother performing the prince's actions and then used that footage to create the animations for the game. The realism gives the game a timeless feel, removing it from its peers and placing it in a league all of its own, and exacerbates the magical quality of the Persian setting. Rotoscoping isn't too far removed from the way motion capture is used in video game development today. If anything, rotoscoping was a precursor to motion capture and quite innovative for 1989. But that's not how Jordan Mechner saw it. For him, rotoscoping was just a way to make the animations look good because Mechner wasn't particularly good at drawing or animating. And because of his pragmatism, we can now say that Prince of Persia was a game ahead of its time. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for the sequels that followed. The success of Prince of Persia led to two subsequent sequels. The first, titled Prince of Persia 2: The Shadow and the Flame, arrived in 1993 and picks up the story 11 days after the end of the first. Shadow and the Flame was received quite well upon its release and praised for how it built upon its predecessor while retaining what made the first game so special. That said, I can't help but feel that this game is more of the same rather than a solid evolution of the formula. Change would come in good time, but I think Prince of Persia changed in a way that nobody wanted. In 1999, having swapped hands from Broderbund to the Learning Company and subsequently into the hands of Mattel, yes, that Mattel, came the arrival of Prince of Persia 3D, or as it was known on the Sega Dreamcast, Prince of Persia Arabian Nights. This was a big move for the franchise, taking the prince from a 2D landscape and into the world of 3 dimensions. Once again, the game was set in medieval Persia and heavily influenced by the tales of the 1001 Nights, but this time, Prince didn't see the success that his predecessors had. The reception for Prince of Persia 3D was lukewarm at best. Reviews of the game vary, but the general consensus is that it was quite sluggish to play and suffered from occasional camera issues. However, its biggest downfall is its lack of innovation. It's very obvious that Pop 3D has taken an awful lot of cues from another hugely popular platformer at the time, specifically Tomb Raider. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, games continue to inspire other games even today, but it's disappointing how unoriginal Pop 3D is given its franchise's roots. After all, Prince of Persia was ahead of its time, and the negative reception that this game received led to Mechner distancing himself not just from the series, but from the video game industry entirely. In 2001 though, Mattel sold their Learning Company catalogue to Ubisoft. Founded in 1986, the company had yet to break into the US market and were keen to get their hands on an intellectual property with enough clout to do just that. Prince of Persia, despite 3D's reception, was such a game with that level of industry influence. The only trouble was that Mechner still held the IP rights to the series, and he wasn't all that willing to make another game. If Ubisoft wanted to get this project up off the ground, they first had to get the green light from Mechner, and it was down to creative director Patrice Désilets and producer Yanis Malat to do just that. The development team put together several concepts of what they envisioned for the game. Not only was Mechner genuinely impressed by what the team had to show, but actively sought to come on board and help out as a creative consultant, even going so far as to pen an original story for the game. The game wouldn't be a continuation of the original storyline, but instead would be a full reboot that drew inspiration from the first game and the Knight's stories alone. And honestly, this was the best decision they made. On October 28, 2003, Prince of Persia made its stunning return with Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. A real standout feature of Sands of Time is its characterization of the prince. In previous iterations, the prince was little more than a nameless protagonist trying to save the woman he loves. Here, however, he is a deeply flawed and arrogant individual who finds himself caught in a nightmare of his own making. I feel it important to say this now, as I will be cycling back and forward to the prince and his character throughout this analysis. The game begins in India, where Shahraman, the proud king of Persia, on his way to visit the Sultan of Azad, decides to invade a Maharaja's palace and steal its riches and wonders for gifts to give to the Sultan. Accompanied by his son, the prince, Shahraman and his armies lay siege to the palace, aided by the Maharaja's vizier, who's turned traitor. The young prince, determined to bring both honour and glory to his father, barrels headlong into the battle, aiming to be the first to reach the Maharaja's treasure vaults, and is quickly thrown from his horse. Here is where the game begins proper. The story isn't told in the present. Not exactly anyways. While we experience the game from moment to moment as it happens, the events are actually a retelling from the prince sometime in the future, telling his tale to an unknown individual, presumably us, the player. This is the first concrete piece of narrative design influenced directly from the Knight's stories. The prince's narration evokes the same fairy tale sentiment that Scheherazade does in Knights. Throughout the game, the prince will comment on his surroundings or explain certain actions by the player, and it elevates the narrative by providing context that is unique to the prince's past experience.
The fabled menagerie of Azad, the Sultan's pride and joy. It had been one of the wonders of the world. As a child, I dreamed of it and longed to see it with my own eyes. Now it was a place of terror, an abandoned ruin laid waste by the sands of time.
We're not just seeing the story from the prince's perspective, we're seeing it as he remembers it. The narration is also cleverly woven into the gameplay as well. If you leave the game paused for too long, the prince will ask if he should go on, or upon saving, the prince will say that he will start the story from here next time.
Shall I go on? Then I'll continue.
Arguably, the most memorable instance of this is when the prince dies, leading the narrator prince to proclaim that that's not how things happened.
That didn't happen.
It's a simple means of utilising the frame story motif, but it's one that sells the storytelling and is a fun way of acknowledging that you've messed up. There's also a distinct contrast between the prince we play as and the narrator prince. The latter is clearly wiser than his younger, more naive counterpart, and it's reflected in his narration. We come to understand the prince through his older, wiser self, and this is apparent almost right from the start. When the prince comes around, he's in the midst of a war-torn hellscape, where steel clashes with steel and blood is spilled. Yet the narrator is quick to point out that the prince in that moment doesn't feel regret for the destruction his people have brought to India. He's a young man driven by one thing and one thing alone, and that's pleasing his father. But not through bloodshed, that must be said. This is a man who, despite his arrogance, has a heart. Once inside the palace, the prince descends into the lower levels until he finds the treasure vaults. Immediately, his attention, and ours for that matter, is taken by the Dagger of Time. The prince believes that this is the exact kind of treasure that will bring him the honour and glory he seeks, and he is so blinded by this that he completely ignores another treasure just below him. The sands of time themselves are in this very room, and the prince takes no notice of them. Neither does the narrator draw them to our attention. They're deliberately left unnoticed unless we take the initiative to look upon them ourselves. It's a very subtle piece of characterization that further bolsters just how naive this young prince is. But having pillaged the Maharaja's treasure vaults and claimed the dagger as his own, the prince and his father continue on to the palace of Azad, along with several captured women as offerings for the sultan, including the Maharaja's daughter, Farah. The Maharaja's vizier has also joined the company, which I'm sure won't be a problem anytime soon, and not long after arriving in Azad, Shahraman presents the sultan with the sands of time. It's a gift one can be proud to boast about, shared between two equally proud and powerful men. The vizier recognises this almost immediately and speaks of the wonders contained within the hourglass holding the sands, claiming that the only thing capable of opening the hourglass is the dagger. Without giving a single thought as to what he is about to do, the prince uses the dagger to open the hourglass, releasing the sands of time and with them, hell. Within seconds, the palace and its people are ravaged by the sands. The only ones left untouched are the prince, Farah and the vizier, who are protected by magical objects later to become known as artifacts of time. There's no real explanation given to these objects or their magical properties aside from the dagger, but this decision evokes the knight's tales once again. In his introduction, written for the Penguin Classics editions of the Tales, N.J. Darwood describes the tales as the spontaneous products of untutored minds, which would reach out in search of the most imaginative and extravagant fancies and then relate them to the universal constants of this life. What he means by this is that despite the night stories featuring magic or magical objects, the supernatural elements are interwoven with the everyday realism of the world and the time that they were written in. In modern writing, we have a saying for this type of storytelling. We call it magic realism. The power of these objects isn't explained because it doesn't have to be. Their existence doesn't undermine the grounded realism of the story's place and setting, but instead is a part of it. With the Sands of Time now released, and with sand creatures walking its halls, the Palace of Azad is a mere shadow of its former self. Recognizing Farah as a woman captured in India, the prince follows her through the crumbling palace, passing through guest chambers and master bedrooms before catching up with her. The two share a brief encounter, but it's quickly disturbed by huge sand-infested scarab beetles, because you can't tell a western story set in the Middle East without scarab beetles. The prince tells Farah to return to the reception hall, and on his way back there, the prince plays a part in activating the palace's defense systems, which I will return to momentarily, because as we will soon see, that was not a wise move. Upon returning to the reception hall, the prince comes face to face with his father, who has been totally consumed by the sands. And following a lengthy battle, the prince has no choice but to kill his own father. This is quite a turning point for the prince, as I'm sure you can imagine. After the fight, the prince is cold, defeated, his cockiness and arrogance all but gone. In their place is anger for the man who is truly responsible for this nightmare. With Farah in tow, the two set off to stop the vizier, seal the hourglass and undo the damage wrought by the sands. By now, we're well and truly into the meat of this game, and I think it's time to step away from the story and look solely at the gameplay, at least for a little while. Sands of Time is a massive evolution of the Prince of Persia formula in almost every way, but that said, the game remains as true to its origins as it can. From the moment we set foot in India, we are introduced to the Prince's expanded moveset. This version of the Prince is far more acrobatic and versatile than his previous iterations. While he can still run, jump and climb ledges, this game adds an entirely new parkour system, and as a result, the Prince can now run along walls, swing from poles and ropes, and jump between columns effortlessly. Parkour is like web swinging in a Spider-Man game. It's easy to pick up, but it takes a little time to master. The pace of the gameplay is constantly moving at a rapid pace because you are seldom standing still, and the experience is all the more thrilling because of it. Level design greatly complements the parkour too. Each location is immensely high, and the task at hand is usually to move up and down throughout the level to solve puzzles or simply move on to the next location. Parkour is also particularly useful when it comes to avoiding traps. Do you remember when the Prince activated the palace's defense systems? Do you remember when I said that wasn't a wise move? Yeah. Well, this is why. The traps are quite varied in Sands of Time, consisting of spiky poles, spinning saw blades, whatever the hell this thing is, and collapsing floors, just to name a few. Having the Prince be the one who activated the traps is hilarious, but that said, they don't add much of a challenge and can be easily avoided once you nail down their timing. Later in the game, when the Prince is joined by Farah, the two must work together to solve puzzles and open doors. Farah can't pull off the same acrobatic moves that the Prince can, but she can crawl through cracks either in walls or under doors, meaning she's able to access switches and levers that aren't accessible to the Prince. Often, the trick to solving a puzzle is to ensure Farah can reach higher areas of whatever location you happen to be in. Whether that's by raising platforms or lowering ladders for her to climb, she soon becomes an integral part of the exploration and pulls her weight in the adventure. For a companion character, Farah does her job well, and for the most part is quite reliable when exploring the palace. In combat, however, things are a little bit different. Combat is far more than just whacking enemies with a sword. Sure, that is the primary objective, but the acrobatics are just as integral to the combat as they are to the exploration. It's an incredibly varied system, and the dagger also plays a massive role in combat. Knockdown enemies will get back up after a few seconds, and the only way to finish them for good is by using the dagger. Pressing triangle near a downed enemy triggers a sand retrieval, where the Prince drives the dagger into the fallen enemy and absorbs their sand. This mechanic adds a layer of urgency to combat, especially when you find yourself surrounded by enemies, all of which are usually standing in your way. Fights are tense as a result, but that's only until you realise just how shallow the combat actually is. Success in combat isn't down to skill, it's down to how fast you can knock enemies down. The easiest way to do this is by vaulting over them, and soon combat becomes a repetitive slog of X, square, square, triangle. If you haven't noticed from the footage by now, this is the method I rely on the most and actively have to go out of my way to engage with the combat system in other ways. Honestly, it's quite disappointing how trivial the combat is, especially since the Prince's moveset is so varied. If anything, the biggest obstacle in combat is Farah. Equipped with a bow and arrow, Farah is able to take pot shots at enemies and can even knock some of them down for you. She also has a horrendous habit of drawing attention to herself, and 2 or 3 well-aimed hits from an enemy can finish her off. It's up to you to listen out for whenever she cries out for help, and you best move quickly, otherwise she's going down. Not to mention, Farah can also accidentally hit the Prince with an arrow and it will knock off some of your health. At full health, this is actually quite funny. At low health, not so much. Aside from Farah, the camera also creates an issue in combat. Because the camera is locked to the Prince and because you are always moving in a fight, the camera is constantly readjusting itself based on what the Prince is doing and where he is. It's fine for the most part. I never had any real issue with the camera, but it often hid some enemies off screen in tighter areas who had a tendency to attack from my blind spot. Either that or it locks in front of the Prince and I can't actually see the enemy that he's facing off against. That's not really something that you want when you're in the middle of a sword fight. To be perfectly honest though, I don't consider Farah or the camera to be real issues with the combat. Its problems are far deeper than that, and are born from poor execution. Not even the game's boss fights, of which there are only 2, are in any way memorable. Really, the only difference is that you just have to hit them a little more than other enemies, but that's about the height of it. But combat isn't just sword fighting. As well as this, the Prince is also able to manipulate time. The dagger isn't just a means of finishing off enemies. Wielding it allows the Prince to slow down time. He can also freeze enemies in place just by jabbing them with the dagger, and then he's even able to freeze every enemy on screen. The Prince also has the power to rewind time. This means if you fall in combat or mistime a jump, you're able to avoid death and try again. It's quite a clever little feature, especially for a platformer, but it must be said that it isn't a power that can be abused, and that's what I like about it. The amount of times that you can rewind time is limited by the amount of full sand tanks you have. Once you run out of sand, there's no more do-overs. It's game over. All of these little things kind of add a bit of strategy to how you play, and I quite honestly like this addition to the game. While I appreciate the time powers, I do find them rather lacking. They certainly spice things up, but they don't really elevate the combat in any meaningful way. It's still just as trivial even if you don't use them. They do, however, spice up the parkour, making it a touch easier to navigate traps. All in all, Sands of Time's gameplay is solid. The combat leaves a lot to be desired, but it's serviceable, and really it's the parkour where the most fun is to be had. It never gets tiring, and only becomes more satisfying the more experienced you are with it. But that's about all I can say on the gameplay, so I think it's high time we checked back in on what the Prince and Farah are doing. Now, where was I? When we last left the Prince and Farah, the two had set off towards the Tower of Dawn, where the Prince saw the hourglass being carried off to earlier. From here, the palace opens up into a wide variety of locales, including a bats area, a menagerie, a massive library, and even a prison. These areas are beautifully crafted, and the Prince almost always has something to say about each, even tying them symbolically to his own circumstances.
In my father's palace was a prison much like this. I had never set foot inside. Now here I was, myself a prisoner, seeking an escape.
There's also an overwhelming sense of eeriness throughout this game. It's not outright horror, but you subtly feel just how much damage the Sands of Time have caused without it ever really being called to attention. What really drove the point home for me was the vision the Prince has in the final sandstorm. Sandstorms are these glowing beacons which are created after you clear out an area of enemies. They act as save points, but interacting with them shows the Prince a vision of the future. Here we aren't shown a glimpse of the future, but instead we are shown one of the past. The vision moves through each location we visited along the way to the Tower of Dawn, and each is completely barren and entirely devoid of life. It makes you realise that the sand creatures we've been killing up until now were once people. With them all gone, there's nobody left to fill the palace's halls. Once again, this is a very subtle piece of storytelling, but one which perfectly encapsulates the emotional weight of what the Prince has done. The only real reprieve we get from the silent horror of Azad comes from the blossoming relationship between Farah and the Prince. Although they have every reason to mistrust each other, as the Prince so wisely points out, that doesn't stop the two of them from growing close. I never understood why Farah and the Prince developed feelings for each other. Personally, I've always considered it a little bit Disney, if you know what I mean, but I have come to appreciate it the older I've gotten. Farah is almost solely responsible for lifting the Prince out of his arrogance. She isn't all that fond of him at first, and his views on her and women in general are, how shall I put this, archaic?
With women, you need to show them you're in charge right from the start, or they'll walk all over you. I've been too indulgent. Probably because I felt sorry for her. Well, it stops now.
But it's through her perspective that he sees the importance of the task ahead. The Prince's feelings towards Farah do feel natural and earned, and his opinions towards her and women soften over time, although they were mostly played for laughs anyways. Again, little moments like this solidify the Prince's growth, and before long the line between him and the narrator Prince starts to blur. The Prince is becoming wiser the longer we play as him, and we're seeing that firsthand. It's a wonderful sight to behold. Eventually, having trekked through the entire palace, the Prince and Farah finally arrive at the top of the Tower of Dawn. The Vizier is nowhere to be found, but the hourglass is right in front of them, and the Prince wastes no time in getting on top of the hourglass and is just about to seal the sands of time away when he hesitates. To be fair, I totally get it. I mean, look at it from his point of view. The last time the Prince stood this close to the sands of time, he was duped into opening them, and we all know how that turned out. So I can understand why the dude is quick to doubt Farah and her true loyalties. His hesitation, however, gives the Vizier the opportunity to sneak up on them and almost get his hands on the dagger. Thankfully, he doesn't. The dagger remains safe with the Prince and Farah, who now find themselves lost in a tomb.
Sorry.
Where are you?
I'm right here.
Hold my hand. Don't let go. I didn't mean what I said.
No, you're right. All that's happened is my doing. I wanted honor and glory. I brought this on us.
Now, let's pause here for a moment, because this is the part of the game where things start to get a little weird. Everything slows down, right down as a matter of fact, and Farah and the prince find themselves alone in a place that I'm not entirely sure is Azad. Up until now, the prince has been able to slip off into this strange location at the centre of which is a fountain. In what is quite possibly the most realistic game mechanic I have ever seen, drinking water is how you restore your health in Sands of Time. But drinking from this specific fountain increases the prince's overall health. And entering this area often sees the prince running down a hallway with sheer cloths hanging from the ceiling. These also happen to be in this area, an area in which the prince and Farah get it on in a bath. Look, I get why this part is here. It's the growth of their relationship reaching its pinnacle and allows the prince to cast aside the doubt he felt before. What I don't understand is why I have to go through this tedious door minigame in order to proceed. This is easily the worst part of the game, and it isn't even doing anything that's outright wrong. The puzzle requires you to walk through very specific doors until you find Farah, but there's no real way to solve the puzzle without brute forcing it through trial and error. Supposedly, when you stand in front of certain doors, you can hear Farah splashing around in water, signifying the right door. But honestly, this never worked for me. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes to get through this segment, and that's 10 to 15 minutes that I could be doing quite literally anything else except for this. It's quite out there compared to everything that's come before, and while I admire their bravery in designing such a segment, I do think Ubisoft dropped the ball a little on this one. Not much, but definitely a little. But soon after, it's revealed to be nothing more than a dream. Or was it? It's never really explained, and it doesn't really matter, so we're just going to move on. When the prince comes to, he finds that Farah is gone, and along with her, the Dagger of Time. She's taken matters into her own hands, and who can blame her, after the prince's ludicrous display only moments earlier. The prince follows suit, scaling the outside of the tower, and without the dagger to hand, his ability to rewind time is gone. Nevertheless, he makes it to the top and finds Farah outnumbered by sand creatures. One knocks her into a hole above the hourglass, and the prince grabs hold of the dagger in a desperate attempt to save her, but it isn't enough. And then...
Farah, no!
The prince has well and truly lost everything. He is a broken man, racked by guilt. I could tell you what happens next, but this is a scene that needs to speak for itself.
No. No.
The girl is unimportant. Now, give me the dagger, and I will give you power. Eternal life will be yours.
Live forever, when those I loved are dead and I to blame. I choose death.
The prince seals the sands and in the process rewinds time, not just to the moment they were opened, but further back to the night before he and his father's army invaded India. The prince still remembers everything that happened, or to put it more accurately, he remembers everything that is yet to happen. The prince races into the city, infiltrating the Maharaja's palace once again, only this time it's to find another treasure entirely. The prince is reunited with Farah, who has no memory of what transpired in Azad, and so the prince takes it upon himself to tell his tale. It's finally revealed that all along the prince wasn't telling us his story, but was actually telling it to Farah, as a means of warning her of what is to come and who is the man to blame. As the sun rises over India and as the prince concludes his tale, the vizier emerges from the shadows for one final showdown. I've neglected to speak of the vizier until now, and there's good reason for that. He's hardly present throughout the game. He shows up once after the Prince and Farah reach the Tower of Dawn, but that's about it, and I don't really have much to say about him since he's about as generic as evil villains come. He's a dying man, and the only thing that can save him is eternal life, something which only the sands can give him. This is why he betrays the Maharaja, why he dupes the prince into releasing the sands, but the sands are useless to him without the dagger. This is why he wants it so badly. The vizier is quite similar to his 1989 counterpart. They're both seeking one thing, there's one obstacle standing in their way, and they're just plain evil. It's not much, but he does serve his purpose to the story, and that's really all any villain needs to be. With the vizier defeated and revealed to be a traitor, the dagger is returned to Farah, and all is well. Farah asks why the prince would invent such a story to tell the truth, and the prince is happy to leave it at just a story, although not without rewinding time one last time.
Such nonsense. I said I owe you thanks. You presume too much. Such a fantastic story. Do you think me a child, that I would believe such nonsense?
You're right. It was just a story.
This is a classic piece of adventure storytelling. It takes enough from the night stories to give it that epic fairy tale-like feeling, but the story is strong enough to stand on its own 2 feet. Its weaker elements, the vizier in particular, are still sufficient enough to contribute to the story's overall strength. But this is very much the prince's tale, and without him it wouldn't be as good as it is. The prince's growth is methodical, but earned, and with each new blow he truly becomes a better man than he was at the start of the game. He realises how insignificant honour and glory actually are, especially when the price he must pay for them is the lives of those he loves the most. I genuinely felt sorry for him at the end of the game. Even though he managed to set things right, the woman he had fallen in love with has no memory of him or their time together. It stings, and a story that can evoke such a reaction in a viewer is deserving of such praise. There was a lot of expectation riding on the shoulders of Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. On the one hand, it was following on the heels of a game that was so poorly received, its own creator disowned it, distancing himself from the franchise that it belonged to. It was also a game pegged to shoot Ubisoft into the stratosphere. It had to make a good impression, and I think it did more than achieve this. Not only was Sands of Time a massive success for Ubisoft, not only did it revitalise the franchise, but it also introduced the series to a new generation of players in the best way possible. Sands of Time isn't a perfect game. Its combat leaves a lot to be desired, and there are times when its design, intentional or not, doesn't land quite as well as it should. But rarely does the game trip over itself. For the most part, this is a solid 3D platformer with satisfying gameplay and a story worth losing yourself in. Of course, the story is really nothing without the prince. Finally, after 14 years, the prince has something resembling a character. He's far more than just a nameless protagonist. He is the hero of his own tale, and his growth is spectacular. Time is a curious thing, but in this case, time has been especially kind to Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. It's aged it like a fine wine, and while my earliest memories of playing this game may be fractured and hazy now, I can say with absolute certainty that they are not dressed up by nostalgia. This game is truly as impressive as I remember it being, and it is a game that deserves to endure far longer than it already has.